Good morning, Connecting Point. We're carrying on in our study of the life of David, and we only have 2 weeks left in our first kind of crack at these books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're going to be wrapping up our first part next week. So in this penultimate message, we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 18, and 18 picks up right after the story that happens in 1 Samuel 17, which Mark took us through the last couple of weeks, David and Goliath. And it carries on looking at this character, David, this meteor who has shot into the Israelite public life. I really enjoyed Mark's description of how David's kingdom begins to emerge right within and next to Saul's kingdom, and that what we see happening in the story of David and Goliath is this emergence of a new kingdom as Saul's kingdom is continuing to carry on. And I'm going to explore that a little bit further because it is something that we're going to see right up until the time that Saul actually fails and falls as the king of Israel. So chapter 18 picks up right on the heels. It kind of actually carries on the dialogue immediately from the end of chapter 17. And as we turn to this text, you're going to notice that that David's new status means certain things about who he is in the nation of Israel. And now, as I read through this chapter, I was really struck by two things. The first of them is just the pacing of the story. As we have this huge zoom in on David's first fight, his first kind of foray into public life. But then chapter 18 almost sort of feels like a montage of all of David's successes and Saul's increasing frustration and consternation and fear increasing as he watches this young upstart succeed. But the second of these, the things that I really noticed, is about how David approaches living out the values of his kingdom, which isn't really his kingdom. It is God's kingdom. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. But even as David is participating in Saul's kingdom, he's living out the values of the kingdom that he is going to be the champion of. David is not so idealistic that he can't work for the success of Saul. But neither is he so pragmatic that he's only going to work for his own political ends and goals. He finds a balance of being driven by the ideal, but working for the good of the flawed institution at the same time. Let's read through chapter 18 together. It's 30 verses long, or thereabouts. And then I'll give you a table talk after we read through the chapter. When David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan and David became bound together in close friendship. Jonathan loved David as much as he did his own life. Saul retained David on that day and did not allow him to return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David, for he loved him as much as he did his own life. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with the rest of his gear, including his sword, his bow, and even his belt. On every mission on which Saul sent him, David achieved success, so Saul appointed him over the men of war. This pleased not only all the army, but also Saul's servants. When the men arrived after David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women from all the cities of Israel came out singing and dancing to meet King Saul. They were happy as they played their tambourines and three-stringed instruments. The women who were playing the music sang, "Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." This made Saul very angry. The statement displeased him, and he thought, "They've attributed to David tens of thousands, but to me they've attributed only thousands. What does he lack except the kingdom?" And so Saul was keeping an eye on David from that day onward. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he prophesied within his house. Now David was playing the lyre as usual. There was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul threw the spear, thinking, "I'll nail David to the wall." But David escaped from him on 2 different occasions. And so Saul feared David, because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. Saul removed David from his presence and made him a commanding officer. David led the army out to battle and back. Now David achieved success in all he did, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how very successful he was afraid of him, but all Israel and Judah loved David, for he was the one leading them out to battle and back. And then Saul said to David, "Here's my oldest daughter, Merab. I want to give her to you in marriage. Only be a brave warrior and fight for me and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul thought, "There's no need for me to raise my hand against him. Let it be the hand of the Philistines." David said to Saul, "Who am I? Who are my relatives or the clan of my father in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" When the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she instead was given in marriage to Adriel, who was from Meholah. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul about this, it pleased him. Saul said, "I will give her to him, so that she may become a snare to him, and so the hand of the Philistines may be against him." And so Saul said to David, "Today is the second time for you to become my son-in-law." And then Saul instructed his servants, "Tell David secretly, the king is pleased with you, and all his servants like you, so now become the king's son-in-law." So Saul's servants spoke these words privately to David. David replied, "Is becoming the king's son-in-law something insignificant to you? I'm just a poor and lightly esteemed man." When Saul's servants reported what David had said, Saul replied, "Well, here's what you should say to David. There is nothing that the king wants as a price for the bride, except 100 Philistine foreskins, so that he can be avenged of his enemies." Now Saul was thinking that he could kill David by the hand of the Philistines. So his servants told David these things, and David agreed to become the king's son-in-law. Now the specified time had not yet expired, when David, along with his men, went out and struck down 200 Philistine men. David brought their foreskins and presented all of them to the king, so that he could become the king's son-in-law. Saul then gave him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David, and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him. Saul continued to be at odds with David from then on. The leaders of the Philistines would march out, and as often as they did so, David achieved more success than all of Saul's servants. His name was held in high esteem. So before we get too deep into the particularities of this text, I just wanted you to take a moment to notice who the subject of this chapter is. Let's take a table talk to explore this for a moment. Here's the question: who do you learn more about in this story, Saul or David? Chapter 16 had shown us a little bit of David entering into courtly life as a musician who's providing some sort of peace of mind for Saul with his playing and singing. And we see his presence at court, increasing here. His profile and his popularity have now been elevated a lot, so that he can no longer be going back and forth between his music therapy duties at the court and his responsibility to be the shepherd of his dad's flocks back in Bethlehem. Mind you, David's victory over Goliath has theoretically earned his family tax relief and put them in a better financial position now. So conceivably, David isn't as needed at home with this new boon for his family. So Saul is now going to keep David around, at least until he can no longer bear the sight of him, which is coming up shortly. Part of this popularity for David is seen through these immediate bonds that we see him forge with Saul's children. We open the chapter with Jonathan becoming David's best friend, basically. Jonathan is Saul's heir apparent. And in chapter 14, when we first met him, we saw that Jonathan was not really like Saul in many significant ways. His attitude is much more amenable to the kingdom of David, as it were, than it is to the kingdom of Saul. And if the criteria for that being thinking about who is actually in charge of things, right? Saul is actually trying to be in charge of things. He's worried about his control. David is very much in this mindset of that the Lord is with me and that God is the one who's really in control, and I just get to be his servant first and foremost, no matter what the other circumstances are that are going on around me. We saw in chapter 14 that Jonathan was far less interested in appearing powerful, but was aware that the real power in any given situation was God's. Recall his words to his armor bearer when they went up to attack the Philistine outpost, and you can find this in chapter 14, verse 6. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will intervene for us. Nothing can prevent the Lord from delivering, whether by many or by a few." So here now Jonathan sees David's success, a deliverance by a few, as it were, but something about David has further drawn him. Maybe it's David's charisma, or maybe they're just at the same age and have the same inside jokes, or maybe it's truly the awareness of God's presence in each other's lives, or something like that. But we see that they become bonded like brothers, better even than David's biological brothers. Jonathan gives David gifts, and they point to this inception of the kingdom of David, as it were, this passing of the inheritance almost, right? The sword, the robe, the rest of the gear, the bow and everything, they all represent Jonathan's inheritance in some sense. So you can imagine Saul is in court, David shows up to do his music therapy session, and there he is wearing Jonathan's robe. Like what an insult that is to Saul's kingdom. What a weird power grab by this young upstart, right? Nevertheless, Saul goes about appointing David into a command of the army, which his own servants approve, whether for Saul's mental health or for just confidence in what David is doing. We're not entirely sure. We get this kind of opaque view of these servants. But Saul's grip on his kingdom and sanity are continuing to erode. And were Saul a more secure individual, it might not have mattered so much. You can almost kind of imagine that if Saul had some degree of confidence in himself, he didn't need to be seen as the big man or whatever, that he would have just been excited that he had this new youngster who could go and fight his battles for him while he still received glory for it, right? While he still performed his duties as the protector of the people by appointing the best guy for the job in that case, right? But his massive insecurity is shown again through this sequence. His servants are all big fans of David. David's success in battle begets further success with the people in terms of his popularity. And then we get this moment where the women are singing about the triumphs of the people of Israel. Saul has his thousands, David his tens of thousands. And to understate things a fair bit, this rubs Saul the wrong way. Verse 10 and 11 are rightly a source of some question among the commentators, so let's briefly reread them. Here's verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he prophesied within his house. Now David was playing the lyre as usual. There was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul threw the spear, thinking, "I'll nail David to the wall." But David escaped from him on 2 different occasions. So, not just rubbing Saul the wrong way, Saul wants to rub David out of existence based upon David's popularity. The biggest question that arises from this sequence is bound to be that opening construction that an evil spirit came from God and rushed upon Saul. This text reminds me of when God is said to have hardened Pharaoh's heart during the Exodus story. And I think those ones, there's some good parallels to think about between these two texts. We have a person in leadership who has committed to their own power and their own kingdom, to their own knowledge of things, and they are standing in opposition to what God is wanting to do. They are not willing to be a useful servant to God. They are not willing to be used of God, and so they are stuck reaping the consequences of that and of their own hubris, right? These texts often get brought into the free will versus God's sovereignty debate, but none of that is really all that useful as we talk about this in terms of proof texting one over the other. Both of human free will and God's sovereign power are affirmed in the scriptures, and we have to figure out a way to hold those two things in tension, or just accept it, which is probably the right thing to do for most people. And the other text that I'm led to think of when I think about Saul having an evil spirit from God afflicting him is that idea from Romans 1 and 2, where people are committed to their own sin, and what does God do? He gives them over to their sin, right? Rather than forcibly intervening with them and changing their mind, God gives them over to their sin and allows things to happen to them. Because Saul has rejected God's ways, because he's shown that he's more worried about how other people see him, God has now turned him over to his own pride and his own sin, and it is going to get worse and worse for Saul as our story proceeds. Other aspects of the construction of this sequence are also notable. That verb that you saw translated as prophesied in the NET version that I was reading from is the same verb as was found in the sequence from chapter 10, when Saul is overcome with the Spirit of God and then prophesies after being anointed. But there's a different flavor that's given to this verb here. So some of the other translations use raved or raged in place of prophesied to try to indicate his kind of overwhelmed state of mind. In a negative way this time, though. Notice as well that in this sequence, Saul, like Goliath, is holding a spear. The enemies of David seem to be holding spears, and there's a symbolism to this whole sequence. The remarkable irony about the whole series of events here is that Saul attempts to murder David and fear takes place. But notice who is afraid. It's Saul. Saul tries to move David on from courtly life, away from his family, and into a more dangerous role in the army, right? Notice Saul wants to have the Philistines do his dirty work. But David continues to have success and takes over this role that Saul had held as the great warlord of the people. Notice the formulation in describing David's successes. The Lord was with him. We don't get any great insight into David's character through this narrative passage, but we do elsewhere in the Psalms and in the Chronicles. We see repeatedly that David loves the Lord. He loves the law of God, that he puts his trust in God, that God is his provision and his strength. I don't know that I would have continued confidence in the Lord if I showed up at my job and someone tried to turn me into a pincushion. But it seems that David is confident enough in God, even through the stresses of his time, and that God is indeed working for the good of the one who loves him, as we learn elsewhere in the book of Romans. So I'm going to throw this to a table talk to you, using David as an example, thinking about the ways that you read about him in the Psalms, the kinds of radical moments of trust and love that he shares in the Psalms. I want to ask you this. How do you want to grow in loving God and in putting your confidence in him? Is it through worship? Is it through reading his word? Is it in loving his law, doing what is right? Is it in trusting him to provide, or trusting him to be the strength to overcome the situations that you find yourself in? Take a moment and talk about that together. In the latter half of the story, David is able to re-enter courtly life. He comes back in from the battlefield, as it were, as Saul is kind of stuck making good on this promise that he had made in chapter 17, that the killer of Goliath would get to become the king's son-in-law. So Saul is going to marry off his oldest daughter, Merab, and to David, but then, more battles happen, yada, yada, yada. Merab ends up getting married off to some other local notable. And the interesting thing to see as Saul tries to incorporate David now into the royal family is that his offers are rebuffed by David. And the narrator reports that David comes up with these humble answers, almost like extreme humility, if you think about it. Some of the commentators are a little bit skeptical as to the specifics of why David does this. I mean, David is the grand champion of the Israelites right now, and he calls himself, who am I? I'm just a poor guy from an inconsequential family. He's like, well, yeah, but you're also everyone's favorite right now. I don't know. But one of the other commentators does call it appropriate and right that he would declare himself unworthy to join the royal family, unworthy of the king's daughter. The text offers no specific clues as to the rightness or wrongness of these two girls, young women, for David. Rather, it just kind of reports what happens. David was earmarked for Merab. Merab got married off to someone else, but then Michal comes along and she's in love with David. And so then that union ends up working out. We see here that another of Saul's family members has really become enthralled with this young upstart, his daughter, Michal. Oddly enough, we don't see here what David thinks of her at all. So Saul thinks to attempt to take advantage of this union with Michal by asking for this rather grim bride price to pay for David's entry into the royal family. And we get this odd note that the offer pleases David. That's not the construction in the NET, but maybe in your translation, you see that this pleased David in about verse 26. Presumably because it now seems like a reasonable thing for him to enter into the royal family, having done this service for Saul, taking some revenge upon the enemies of Saul, as it were. The success of David in all of this is kind of undeniable. Well, the story has him meeting the deadline, exceeding the deadline. He's in well under the deadline, in fact. And he hasn't just exceeded the expectations. He went ahead and doubled the price that he had to pay. Which, like, it all kind of is disturbing to think about this offer pleasing David, that he's like, oh, this sounds like a good activity to go and participate in. I don't know. But Saul could not rightly deny David now entry into the royal family. But with David's successes at winning over the heir to the throne, Jonathan, and now one of the princesses, Saul rightly, almost presciently, sees David as the new biggest threat to his throne. Ironically, I think it's fair to say that in all of this, it's Saul's view of David that is the most significant factor in making David a threat to the throne. David has shown nothing but loyalty to Saul and a propensity for helping him with the true enemies of the state of Israel, right? Israel is in this place of existential threat by the Philistine attacks, who, in spite of losing Goliath and now at least 200 other men to just a really humiliating death, are continuing in their aggression towards Israel. And David's success carries one upon the other, even as Saul is trying to off him through the Philistine hands. So we leave off the story here for now, with David at court, a flashing, blinding light, now the king's son-in-law, and seen by the king as the threat to the throne, to Saul's kingdom. David is succeeding, even though Saul is kind of trying to stack the odds against him, right? He's throwing him into more and more dangerous missions. But David is persistent in working for the good of Saul. And the reason is that his loyalty is to something more than Saul's kingdom. David's loyalty is to the people of Israel, but it's also to the God of Israel, right? Mark described it as David's kingdom last week, and he's right, but I want to add more to that when you think about David's success. David sees himself first as a subject of God and of God's kingdom. Saul's authority begins with himself. David's authority begins with the Lord, and the Lord is the one who prospers. Though David is put into this disadvantageous position, though the wheels of state are arrayed against him, though the best strategies of the king are wielded against his success, David is not concerned with these things because his God is for him. We see in this chapter that all of the selfishness and deceit and pride and murderous rage of Saul cannot stand up to what God is going to do. In our time, these days, we need to remember this. Ultimately, we can find a way to navigate between that hard line of idealism that would set us entirely against the powers that be in our time that we operate under. We don't have to do that. We also can avoid being too pragmatic and just giving in to those powers in every way. Our allegiance is first and foremost to our God, and we can serve him and allow him to fight our battles and to lead us where we need to be in right living, and to help us to show love even to our enemies as David showed love to Saul. And that's kind of where I want to leave you with today, is a final table talk question asking you to think about what you see from David in this story, and what you see in his attitude, the way that he responds to the powers of his time, the principalities of his time, and the way that he never varies in his loyalty during these stories, but that he's not immediately concerned with what the earthly powers are doing, because he knows who God is. So here's the table talk question. Does reading a story like this help you to see your struggles in a different light? And then take some time to pray with one another, and have yourselves a great week.